easiest thing in the world is just to like be loyal to the president who's in your political party. That's what all of them pretend to be.
So recently, Dave Smith went on the Tom Woods show talking about the subject of Trump and loyalty, those who have been loyal to Trump and whether or not the president himself reciprocates that in certain cases, and the role in which this influences U.S. politics and U.S. foreign policy and U.S. domestic policy. Dave's a brilliant political analyst on these types of matters, so let's see what he has to say, and please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
It's like that's and there is, I'll say, understandably, there is amongst Trump supporters, and I've experienced a little bit of this myself over the last couple of weeks, but amongst Trump supporters, there is this feeling of like anybody who's not loyal to Donald Trump, anybody who's criticizing Donald Trump is an enemy now. And I understand to some degree where, when you had like Donald Trump's own government, the history of working against him while he was president of the United States of America, being major ways, being framed for treason by your own intelligence agencies. That I understand where they, people develop a kind of a demand for loyalty, and you want to make sure that he's not being sabotaged.
I totally agree with this. This impulse is totally understandable given what Trump went through in his first term when you had the literal deep state trying to frame the president for treason in a hoax. They said that, they had the biggest story in American political history regarding corruption of the U.S. president, even going beyond whatever Nixon was guilty of. This was the story at the time, that Trump, through his administration, were essentially working on behalf of a foreign government, on behalf of Russia. This was the story that was told to you. And it was a complete farce in every way. It grew out of a democratic oppositional kind of effort against Trump, and it was spread throughout the media. Everyone latched onto this and went berserk on this story for a matter of years. And it wasn't until we look back in hindsight to realize how insane that was. But there were Republicans that went against Trump in that moment. They bought hook, line, and sinker what the FBI and the DOJ were selling them. And, that impulse to defend Trump regardless, it makes sense to me regardless. But that doesn't mean that you can't take these things and compartmentalize them and look at some of the real criticisms of Trump and judge them accordingly. Call balls and strikes.
But at the same time, that's not what Thomas Massie's doing here. Thomas Massie had his back in all of those fights, in all of those examples where the swamp was trying. Thomas Massie here is criticizing Donald Trump for continuing the swamp, which is what continuing government spending at this level is. That's the whole thing. The whole swamp is the fact that you got this central government in DC that extracts $7 trillion out of the real economy every year and hands it off to their political cronies. And that's the issue, Donald. This is the core of Drain the Swamp, is cutting government spending. And, Thomas Massie, we got to have some people who will stand up for principles. And I'd also just say, after coming out so hard against Donald Trump over the last couple of weeks, I feel a little bit more liberated to just talk about some of this stuff, which, I have been doing for many years. But, for all the talk about loyalty to Donald Trump, like, when does Donald Trump exhibit loyalty to anyone?
Yeah.
Ever? Donald Trump on January 7th of 2021, Donald Trump came out and called for the book to be thrown at the people who were in that riot on January 6th. He came out and said, oh, yeah, they must be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Now, it is true that 4 years later, he came in and pardoned all of them. But when it was politically difficult to stand up for those people, he didn't.
Dave's right about this. In hindsight, it's very nice that those people received pardons. But Trump was complicit with a government narrative that, the book needs to be thrown at these people. They need to be locked up longer than even the Sedition Act, protesters from World War I, the Eugene Debs of this world. These people were helpless in a legal system that portrayed them as treasonous villains orchestrating an insurrection, an unarmed one, by the way. And that was a lunatic narrative that was completely, again, latched onto by all the mainstream media. Who caught Trump's back in all of that? Thomas Massie, actually. Thomas Massie also caught his back on the Russiagate hoax, as I explained earlier. But what does he get for that? He gets threatened with primaries from Trump. Why? He dares to call out the lunacy that is federal spending under Republicans and Democrats. He does it regardless of who the presidential occupant is. He did it under Biden as well. So he's caught Trump's back far more than a guy like Lindsey Graham has, and Trump specifically endorsed Lindsey Graham on Truth Social. What does he do on Truth Social to Thomas Massie? He drags him repeatedly, spreads falsehoods about him, calls him a traitor to the cause or of America First or whatever that is, even though he's really the only America First legislator truly in an absolute sense in Congress.
He threw him right under the bus. Elon Musk gave him how many hundreds of millions of dollars, plus reinstated him on Twitter, plus all of that. He was very quick to throw him under the bus right away and attacked his character, really, like character assassinated him from the biggest bully pulpit in the world, said that he didn't really have a problem with the spending bill. He just didn't like that there weren't subsidies for electric vehicles in them or something like that.
Which was completely false, by the way. He was always against EV subsidies, even those that, could be hypothetically given to Tesla. And this was before he made, Elon made that tweet about Trump being in the Epstein files, which we all know is true, but that doesn't really tell us much. We know that the investigation would have uncovered material linking the two because they were friends in the 90s. That says nothing about the complicity of Trump in that sex ring. All indications to me are that he broke that relationship with Epstein over a dispute over property in Florida, and the two never rekindled any kind of friendship. But that notwithstanding, that was also an example where Trump didn't exactly pay back the loyalty of Elon Musk. And this wasn't just some Joe Blow schmo. This was a guy that I think threw $200 million to support Trump. He helped get out the vote efforts in swing states, especially in Pennsylvania, to try to usher in this term. He worked diligently in Doge to, enact cuts, but the Republicans were having nothing of it. That was just a vehicle to win election. It wasn't a philosophical vehicle to bring to fruition once they were in power. And this is what you always get with the Republicans. They talk about small government, government cuts, limited government, constitutional government. It's all the buzzwords that they use on the campaign trail, only to shelve it entirely and propagandize on behalf of spending once they get into power. That's what you saw with the big, beautiful bill, and that's what you saw with the Trump CR. To a T, Massie opposed both, and that's why he's being dragged.
After the guy had literally been your warrior,
and sacrificed a lot to do that.
Yeah, Tucker Carlson gave the keynote speech at the Republican National Convention. Didn't stop Trump from throwing him right under the bus as soon as he criticized a war that Donald Trump had gotten us into.
That's exactly true, too. He ripped Tucker over Truth Social as well. Even though the two maintained a cordial relationship, all indication is that they've kind of patched that up for whatever it's worth. So I'm not trying to, create a new scandal here by bringing this up and talking about it. But it does show Trump's impulse is to just turn against those that have reasonable criticisms of them. That's another subject in which Trump campaigned on. He ripped Biden for his targeted strikes in both Yemen and Iran, only to do the exact same thing in both countries once he got power again in his second term. How ironic is that? The same two countries Trump ripped Biden for bombing, he gets right back on the train of the war machine and does the same thing. Now, I'm glad the off-ramp was taken in Iran and in Yemen, but I'm not aware of those theaters being over. Trump had the opportunity to end the theater in Yemen, U.S. involvement in it. He used one of his only presidential vetoes to continue it in his first term. With Iran, they're only under a ceasefire, and as soon as Netanyahu starts to drum up the war propaganda, they're weeks away from a nuke, the U.S. is going to latch on the side of Israel, even if it means shelving true America First measures like a new JCPOA would have been.
I mean, I'm just saying, when is this loyalty ever required of Donald Trump, of him to be decent to the people who have stuck their neck out for him? Donald Trump, okay, listen, he's paid some prices and he got shot at and he's gone to trial and things like that. So I'm not saying he hasn't paid some degree of a price, But there were a lot of people around Donald Trump who paid very high prices, had their careers ruined, were kicked off of tons of different platforms and all this. And I just never really see him going to bat for the people who stick their neck out for him. So at least in this case, one of the things that's kind of cool, and I'm sure Thomas Massie, although it's a tough position to be in, I'm sure he's seen a bit of this, is that people really are rallying behind him as well. And there are people who are just like, nah, dude, you're not going to do this to Massie without this being a big fight. So if you want to do that, fine, we could have this fight. I'll ride with Thomas Massie 100 out of 100 times. So, and I'm not the only one. So at least there's
Me
that.
Too. Yeah, me too. I'll ride with Massie all day long. In fact, I say Massie 2028. And don't get me wrong, he has no chance of winning the presidency in 2028. But for him to be a presidential candidate on the world stage, with the new independent media rising and holding interviews with presidential candidates in ways they never would have before, that was the critique of, people that made fun of the whole Ron Paul campaign, as he was just ignored by the mainstream media. He was. Jon Stewart had that funny bit about how Ron Paul was the 13th floor of a hotel. We just don't talk about him. We don't pretend he exists. But now it's a different world. We're living, years and decades removed from the old school legacy media, where you can't just hide everything under a rug from the dissident voices like Thomas Massie. And for Trump to drag Massie, it really is ironic, because in some ways Trump seems to reward his political opponents far more than those that have caught his back in the times that mattered, like in Russiagate, like in the Jan 6 hoax, like in the orchestrated attempt to keep him off the ballots in the states. Massie supported him through all those things. He just doesn't support the insane spending and the war regime that continues to be maintained regardless of who wins the presidency. That's what we've seen my entire lifetime. So I'm with Massie all the way. I think Dave put it perfectly here. We don't see loyalty rewarded from Trump in many regards. He instead, rewards little Marco. Marco Rubio becomes the Secretary of State despite their past of, vigorous animosity, which was very clear to people that watched that play out in 2015 and 2016. He rewards Lindsey Graham by, allowing him to be in the diplomatic parties talking to the Russians and Ukrainians in a war that he wants to continue dumping money into. He's saying that, America never spent better dollars because it doesn't have to involve its own soldiers over here. It's ludicrous. And he endorses this guy. He's the neocon of neocons, Lindsey Graham is. So Trump's priorities are backwards in many regards, especially when it comes to the reasonable critiques of him. The people that just say, hey, we just want you to do what you campaigned on. That's what Thomas Massie's doing. And, Trump has an incredible cult of personality around him that will denigrate Massie at no cost. They're going to try this primary. I think they're not going to be successful. Massie is immensely popular in his own district, and it's clear why. He stands on principle in an area where people care about standing on principle. But what do you guys think? Let me know down below. Is Dave Smith right about Trump and loyalty? How has Trump rewarded some of the people that have been loyal to him? Let me know down below. Am I off about something? Is there things that Dave or me are overlooking in regard to this? I want to hear from you on that. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel. Subscribe also to Tom Woods. He's a personal friend of mine. An amazing podcast is The Tom Woods Show. And please consider becoming a YouTube member. If you do that, you get advanced viewing of all my videos before they come out on YouTube. And you support the channel, which goes a long way. And I'll bow to you in appreciation if you choose to support me that way. And until I see you guys in the future, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.